This is the children of Hurin, the Narnichin Hurin.
Chapter 8. The Land of Bow and Helm. In the days that followed, Beleg laboured much for the good of the company. Those that were hurt or sick he tended, and they were quickly healed. For in those days the grey elves were still a high people, possessing great power, and they were wise in the ways of life and of all living things. And though they were less in crafts and lore than the exiles from Valinor, they had many arts beyond the reach of men. Moreover, Beleg the archer was great among the people of Doriath. He was strong and enduring, and far-sighted in mind as well as eye, and at need he was valiant in battle, relying not only upon the swift arrows of his longbow, but also upon his great sword, Anglachel. And ever the more did hatred grow in the heart of Nim, who hated all elves, as has been told, and who looked with a jealous eye on the love that Turin bore to Beleg. When winter passed, and the stirring came, and the spring, the outlaws soon had sterner work to do. Morgoth's might was moved, and as the long fingers of a groping hand, the forerunners of his armies probed the ways into Beleriand. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth? Who can measure the reach of his thought? Who had been Melkor, mighty among the Ainur of the great song, and sat now the dark lord upon a dark throne in the north, weighing in his malice all the tidings that came to him, whether by spy or by traitor, seeing in the eyes of his mind and understanding far more of the deeds and purposes of his enemies than even the wisest feared, save Melia, the queen. To her often his thought reached out, and there was foiled. In this year, therefore, he turned his malice towards the lands west of Sirion, where there was still power to oppose him. Gondolin still stood, but it was hidden. Doriath he knew, but could not yet enter. Further still lay Nargothrond, to which none of his servants had yet found the way, a name of fear to them. There the people of Finrod dwelt in hidden strength. And far away from the south, beyond the white woods of the birches of Nimbrethil, from the coast of Alvernian and the mouths of Sirion, came rumour of the havens of the ships. Thither he could not reach until all else had fallen. So now the Orcs came down out of the north in ever greater numbers. Through Anak they came, and Dimbar was taken, and all the north marches of Doriath were infested. Down the ancient road they came, that led through the long defile of Sirion, past the isle where Minas Tirith of Finrod had stood, and so through the land between Moldwyn and Sirion, and then on through the eaves of Brethil to the crossings of Teiglin. Thence of old the road passed on into the guarded plain, and then along the feet of the highlands watched over by Amon Rudh, it ran down into the vale of Narog, and came at last to Nargothrond. But the Orcs did not go far upon that road as yet, for there dwelt now in the wild a terror that was hidden, and upon the red hill were watchful eyes, of which they had not been warned. In that spring Turin put on again the helm of Hador, and Beleg was glad. At first their company had less than 50 men, but the woodcraft of Beleg and the valour of Turin made them seem to their enemies as a host. The scouts of the Orcs were hunted, their camps were spied, and if they gathered to march in force in some narrow place, out of the rocks or from the shadow of the trees, there leapt the Dragonhelm and his men, tall and fierce. Soon, at the very sound of his horn in the hills, their captains would quail, and the Orcs would turn to flight before any arrow whined or sword was drawn. It has been told that when Mim surrendered his hidden dwelling on Amon Rudh to Turin and his company, he demanded that he who had loosed the arrow that slew his son should break his bow and his arrows, and lay them at the feet of him, and that man was Andrug. Then with great ill will, Andrug did as Mim bid. Moreover, Mim declared that Andrug must never again bear bow and arrow, and he laid a curse on him, that if nevertheless he should do so, then would he meet his own death by that means. Now in the spring of that year, Andrug defied the curse of Mim, and took up a bow again in a foray from Bar and Danwed, and in that foray he was struck by a poisoned orc arrow, and was brought back dying in pain. But Beleg healed him of his wound, and now that hatred that Mim bore to Beleg was increased still more, for he had thus undone his curse. But it will bite again, he said. In that year, far and wide in Beleriand, the whisper went, under wood and over stream, and through the passes of the hills, saying that the bow and helm that had fallen in Dimbar, as was thought, had risen again beyond hope. Then many, both elves and men, who went leaderless, dispossessed but undaunted, remnants of battle and defeat, and lands laid waste, took heart again, and came to seek the two captains, though where they had their stronghold none yet knew. Turin received gladly all who came to him, but by the counsel of Beleg he admitted no newcomer to his refuge upon Amon Rudh, and that was now named Sedrin, Camp of the Faithful. The way thither only those of the old company knew, and no others were admitted. But other guarded camps and forts were established round about, in the forest eastward, or in the highlands, or in the southward fens, from Methodin Glad, the end of the wood, south of the crossings of Teglin to Bar Erib, some leagues south of Amon Rudh, in the once fertile land between Narog and the Meres of Sirion. From all these places men could see the summit of Amon Rudh, and by signals received tidings and commands. In this way, before the summer had passed, the following of Turin had swelled to a great force, and the power of Angband was thrown back. Word of this came even to Nargothrond, and many there grew restless, saying that if an outlaw could do such hurt to the enemy, what might not the Lord of Narog do? But Orodreth, king of Nargothrond, would not change his counsels. In all things he followed Thingol, with whom he exchanged messengers by secret ways, and he was a wise lord, according to the wisdom of those who considered first their own people, and how long they might preserve their life and wealth against the lust of the north. Therefore he allowed none of his people to go to Turin, and he sent messengers to say to him that in all that he might do or devise in his war, he should not set foot in the land of Nargothrond, nor drive Orcs thither, but help other than in arms he offered to the two captains, should they have need. And in this, it is thought, he was moved by Thingol and Elion. Then Morgoth withheld his hand, though he made frequent feint of attack, so that by easy victory the confidence of these rebels might become overweening. As it proved indeed, for Turin now gave the name of Dor Cothal to all the land between Teglin and the west march of Doriath, and claiming the leadership of it, he named himself anew Gorthal the Dreadhelm, and his heart was high. But to Beleg it seemed now that the helm had wrought otherwise with Turin than he had hoped, and looking into the days to come, he was troubled in mind. One day, as summer was wearing on, he and Turin were sitting in the Echad, resting after a long affray and march. Turin said then to Beleg, "Why are you sad and thoughtful? Does not all go well since you returned to me? Has not my purpose proved good?" "All is well now," said Beleg. "Our enemies are still surprised and afraid, and still good days lie before us. For a while." And what then? Said Turin. Winter, said Beleg. And after that, another year for those who live to see it. And what then? The wrath of Angband. We have burned the fingertips of the Black Hand. No more. It will not withdraw. But is not the wrath of Angband our purpose and delight? Said Turin. What else would you have me do? You know full well, said Beleg, but of that road you have forbidden me to speak. But hear me now. A king or the lord of a great host has many needs. He must have a secure refuge, and he must have wealth, and many whose work is not in war. With numbers comes the need of food, more than the wild will furnish to hunters, and there comes the passing of secrecy. Amon Rudh is a good place for a few. It has eyes and ears, but it stands alone, and is seen far off, and no great force is needed to surround it, unless a host defends it, greater far than ours is yet, or than it is likely ever to be. Nonetheless, I will be the captain of my own host, said Turin, and if I fall, then I fall. Here I stand in the path of Morgoth, and while I so stand, he cannot use the southward road. Report of the dragon held in the west of Sirion came swiftly to the ear of Morgoth, and he laughed, for now Turin was revealed to him again, who had long been lost in the shadows and under the veils of Beleriand. Yet he began to fear that Turin would grow to such power that the curse that he had laid upon him would become void, and he would escape the doom that had been designed for him, or else that he might retreat to Doriath and be lost to his sight again. Now, therefore, he had a mind to seize Turin and afflict him even as his father, to torment him and enslave him. Beleg had spoken truly when he said to Turin that they had but scorched the fingers of the Black Hand, and that it would not withdraw. But Morgoth concealed his designs, and for that time contented himself with the sending out of his most skilled scouts, and ere long Amon Rudh was surrounded by spies, lurking unobserved in the wilderness, and making no move against the parties of men that went in and out. But he was aware of the presence of Orcs in the lands about Amon Rudh, and the hatred that he bore to Beleg led him now in his darkened heart to an evil resolve. One day in the waning of that year, he told the men in Barin Danwed that he was going with his son Ibun to search for roots for their winter store, but his true purpose was to seek out the servants of Morgoth and to lead them to Turin's hiding place. Nevertheless, he attempted to impose certain conditions on the Orcs, who laughed at him, but Mim said that they knew little if they believed they could gain anything from a petty dwarf by torture. Then they asked him what these conditions might be, and Mim declared his demands, that they pay him the weight in iron of each man whom they caught or slew, but of Turin and Beleg in gold. That Mim's house, when rid of Turin and his company, be left to him, and himself unmolested, that Beleg be left behind, bound for Mim to deal with, and that Turin be let go free. To these conditions, the emissaries of Morgoth readily agreed, with no intention of fulfilling either the first or the second. The Orc captain thought that the fate of Beleg might well be left to Mim. As to letting Turin go free, alive to Angband, were his orders. While agreeing to the conditions, he insisted that they keep Ibun as hostage, and then Mim became afraid, and tried to back out of his undertaking, or else to escape. But the Orcs had his son, and so Mim was obliged to guide them to Barin Danwed. Thus was the house of ransom betrayed. It has been told that the stony mass that was the crown or cap of Amon Rudh had a bare or flattened top, but that steep as were its sides, men could reach the summit by climbing a stair cut into the rock leading up from the shelf or terrace before the entrance to Mim's house. On the summit, watchmen were set, and they gave warning of the approach of the enemies. But these, guided by Mim, came on to the level shelf before the doors, and Turin and Beleg were driven back to the entrance of Baron Dunwed. Some of the men who tried to climb up the steps, cut in the rock, were shot down by the arrows of the Orcs. Turin and Beleg retreated into the cave and rolled a great stone across the passage. In these straits, Andrew revealed to them the hidden stair leading to the flat summit of Amon Rudh, which he had found and lost in the caves, as has been told. Then Turin and Beleg, with many of their men, went up by this stair, and came out on the summit, surprising those few of the Orcs who had already come there by the outer path, and driving them over the edge. For a little while, they held off the Orcs climbing up the rock, but they had no shelter on the summit, and many were shot from below. Most valiant of these was Andrew, who fell, mortally wounded by an arrow at the head of the outside stair. Then Turin and Beleg, with the 10 men left to them, drew back to the center of the summit, where there was a standing stone, and making a ring about it, they defended themselves until all were slain, save Beleg and Turin. For over them the Orcs cast nets. Turin was bound and carried off. Beleg, who was wounded, was bound likewise, but he was laid on the ground with wrists and ankles tied to iron pins driven into the rock. Now the Orcs, finding the issue of the secret stair, left the summit and entered Baron Dunwed, which they had defiled and ravaged. They did not find Mim lurking in his caves, and when they had departed from Amon Rudh, Mim appeared on the summit, and going to where Beleg lay prostrate and unmoving, he gloated over him while he sharpened a knife. But Mim and Beleg were the only living beings in that stony height. Andrew, though himself wounded to the death, crawled among the dead bodies towards them, and seizing a sword, he thrust it at the dwarf. Shrieking in fear, Mim ran to the brink of the cliff and disappeared. He fled down a steep and difficult goat's path that was known to him, but Andrew, putting forth his last strength, cut through the wristbands and fetters that bound Beleg, and so released him. But dying, he said, "My hurts are too deep, even for your healing." Chapter 9. Beleg sought among the dead for Turin to bury him, but he could not discover his body. He knew then that Hurin's son was still alive and taken to Angband, but he remained perforce in Baron Dunwed until his wounds were healed. He set out then with little hope to try to find the trail of the Orcs, and he came upon their tracks near the crossings of Teiglin. There they divided, some passing along the eaves of the forest of Brethil towards the ford of Brithiak, while others turned away westward, and it seemed plain to Beleg that he must follow those that went direct with greater speed to Angband, making for the pass of Anak. Therefore he journeyed on through Dimbar and up to the pass of Anak in Ered Gogoroth, the mountains of Terra, and so to the highlands of Taur and Fuin, the forest under night, a region of dread and dark enchantment, of wandering and despair. Benighted in that evil land, it chanced that Beleg saw a small light among the trees, and going towards it, he found an elf, lying asleep beneath a great dead tree. Beside his head was a lamp, from which the covering had slipped off. Then Beleg woke the sleeper and gave him lambas, and asked him what fate had brought him to this terrible place, and he named himself Gwindor, son of Gwilyn. Grieving, Beleg looked at him, for Gwindor was but a bent and timid shadow of his former shape and mood. When, in the battle of unnumbered tears, that lord of Nargothrond rode to the very doors of Angband, and there was taken. For few of the Noldor whom Morgoth took captive were put to death, because of their skill in mining for metals and gems, and Gwindor was not slain, were put to labor in the mines of the north. These Noldor possessed many of the Fëanorian lamps, which were crystals hung in a fine chain net. The crystals being ever shining with an inner blue radiance, marvelous for finding the way in the darkness of night or in tunnels. Of these lamps, they themselves did not know the secret. Many of the mining elves thus escaped from the darkness of the mines, for they were able to bore their way out. But Gwindor received a small sword from one who had worked in the forges, and when working in a stone gang, turned suddenly on the guards. He escaped, with one hand cut off, and now he lay exhausted under the great pines of Taur the Fuin. From Gwindor, Beleg learned that the small company of Orcs ahead of them, from whom he had hidden, had no captives, and were going with speed, an advance guard, perhaps, bearing report to Angband. At this news, Beleg despaired, for he guessed that the tracks that he had seen turning away westward after the crossings of Teglin were those of a greater host, who had, in Orc fashion, gone marauding in the lands, seeking food and plunder, and might now be returning to Angband by way of the Narrow Land, the long defile of Sirion, much further to the west. If this were so, his sole hope lay in returning to the ford of Brithiac, and then going north to Tol Sirion. But scarcely had he determined on this, than they heard the noise of a great host approaching through the forest from the south, and hiding in the boughs of a tree, they watched the servants of Morgoth pass, moving slowly, laden with booty and captives, surrounded by wolves. And they saw Turin, with chained hands, being driven on with whips. Then Beleg told him of his own errand in Taur the Fuin, and Gwindor sought to dissuade him from his quest, saying that he would but join Turin in the anguish that awaited him. But Beleg would not abandon Turin, and despairing himself, he aroused hope again in Gwindor's heart, and together they went on, following the Orcs, until they came out of the forest on the high slopes that ran down to the barren dunes of the Anfauglith. There, within sight of the peaks of Orodreth, the Orcs made their encampment in a bare dale, and set wolf sentinels all about its rim. There they fell to carousing and feasting on their booty, and after tormenting their prisoners, most fell drunkenly asleep. By that time day was failing, and it became very dark. A great storm rode up out of the west, and thunder rumbled off as Beleg and Gwindor crept towards the camp. When all in the camp were sleeping, Beleg took up his bow, and in the darkness shot 4 of the wolf sentinels on the south side, one by one and silently. Then in great peril they entered in, and they found Turin fettered hand and foot and tied to a tree. All about, knives that had been cast at him by his tormentors were embedded in the trunk, but he was not hurt, and he was senseless in a drugged stupor, or swooned in a sleep of utter weariness. Then Beleg and Gwindor cut the bonds from the tree, and bore Turin out of the camp. But he was too heavy to carry far, and they could go no further than to a thicket of thorn trees high on the slopes above the camp. There they laid him down, and now the storm drew nearer, and lightning flashed on Orodreth. Beleg drew his sword, Anglachel, and with it he cut the fetters that bound Turin. But fate that day was more strong, for the blade of Yol the Dark Elf slipped in his hand and pricked Turin's foot. Then Turin was roused into a sudden wakefulness of rage and fear, and seeing a form bending over him in the gloom with a naked blade in hand, he leapt up with a great cry, believing that Orcs were come again to torment him, and grappling with him in the darkness, he seized Anglachel and slew Beleg Cuthalion, thinking him a foe. But as he stood, finding himself free, and ready to sell his life dearly against imagined foes, there came a great flash of lightning above them, and in its light he looked down on Beleg's face. Then Turin stood stone still and silent, staring on that dreadful death, knowing what he had done, and so terrible was his face, lit by the lightning that flickered all about them, that Gwindor cowered down upon the ground, and dared not raise his eyes. But now in the camp beneath, the Orcs were roused, both by the storm and by Turin's cry, and discovered that Turin was gone, but no search was made for him, for they were filled with terror by the thunder that came out of the west, believing that it was sent against them by the great enemies beyond the sea. Then a wind arose, and great rains fell, and torrents swept down the heights of Taur and Fuin. And though Gwindor cried out to Turin, warning him of their utmost peril, he made no answer, but sat unmoving and unweeping beside the body of Beleg Cuthalion, lying in the dark forest, slain by his hand, even as he cut the bonds of his thraldom from him. When morning came, the storm was passed away eastward over Lothlin, and the sun of autumn rose hot and bright. But the Orcs, hating this almost as much as the thunder, and believing that Turin would have fled far from that place, and all trace of his flight be washed away, they departed in haste, eager to return to Angband. Far off, Gwindor saw them marching northward over the steaming sands of Anfhaudlith. Thus it came to pass that they returned to Morgoth empty-handed, and left behind them the son of Hurin, who sat crazed and unwitting on the slopes of Taur the Fuin, bearing a burden heavier than their bonds. Then Gwindor roused Turin to aid him in the burial of Beleg, and he rose as one that walked in sleep, and together they laid Beleg in a shallow grave, and placed beside him Belthronding, his great bow, that was made of black yew wood. But the dread sword Anglachel Gwindor took, saying that it were better that it should take vengeance on the servants of Morgoth than lie useless in the earth. And he took also the Lambas of Melion to strengthen them in the wild. Thus ended Beleg's strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harboured in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved, and that grief was graven on the face of Turin and never faded. But courage and strength were renewed in the elf of Nargothrond, and departing from Taur in the Fuin, he led Turin far away. Never once, as they wandered together on long and grievous paths, did Turin speak, and he walked as one without wish or purpose, while the year waned and winter drew on over the northern lands. But Gwindor was ever beside him to guard him and guide him, and thus they passed westward over Sirion, and came at length to the beautiful Mere and Aethel Evrin, the springs whence Narog rose beneath the mountains of shadow. There Gwindor spoke to Turin, saying, "Awake, Turin, son of Hurin! On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains unfailing, and guarded from defilement by Ulmo, lord of waters, who wrought her beauty in ancient days." Then Turin knelt and drank from that water, and suddenly he cast himself down, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. There he made a song for Beleg, and he named it Leir Kubeleg, the song of the great bow, singing it aloud, heedless of peril. And Gwindor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, and Turin knew that it was heavy and strong, and had great power, but its blade was black and dull, and its edges blunt. Then Gwindor said, "This is a strange blade, and unlike any that I have seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg even as you do, but be comforted, for I return to Nargothrond, of the house of Finarfin, where I was born and dwelt before my grief. You shall come with me, and be healed and renewed." "Who are you?" said Turin. "A wandering elf, a thrall escaped whom Beleg met and comforted, said Gwindor. Yet once I was Gwindor, son of Gwilin, a lord of Nargothrond, until I went to the Nirnaeth Arnordiad and was enslaved in Angband. Then have you seen Hurin, son of Galdor, the warrior of Dorlomin? Said Turin. I have not seen him, said Gwindor. But the rumour runs through Angband that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin. That I do believe, said Turin. And now they arose, and departing from Aethel Ivrin, they journeyed southward along the banks of Narog, until they were taken by scouts of the elves, and brought as prisoners to the hidden stronghold. Thus did Turin come to Nargothrond.